this afternoon. Hopefully, while it's on not just one, but two difficult topics, sometimes a bit depressing, the pandemic and the planetary crisis, I hope we can have some stimulating interactions and perhaps leave you hopeful that actually in many ways, if you fall asleep listening to my southern dulcet tones, my takeaway lesson or provocation for you is that we do have some warranted hope that responses to the pandemic by states and by citizens give us some hope that we can address the planetary crisis. There's nothing that will guarantee this, but I do think there are some valuable lessons. And indeed, I think there's a hopeful dimension to what we're all going through in terms of the pandemic. So I want to begin by acknowledging particularly all those who've lost their lives in the pandemic, and indeed all those key workers that have kept our societies going. I mean, one of the interesting dimensions of the pandemic is that, and it irritates me when I hear on the news this idea that the economy is closed. It isn't. The economy has been reduced to the provision of basic human necessities. There are many people who are still working in terms of in the retail, the care and healthcare professions. And there's something in that in terms of the opportunity the pandemic offers us for what's sometimes called a great reset, of thinking about building back better, which I'll finish up on in terms of how the pandemic and as we come out of it, offer many opportunities to fix multiple problems, not least in terms of addressing the planetary crisis, of the climate and ecological crisis, but also dealing with things like inequality, food and fuel poverty, and indeed joblessness, because one of the issues that we're going to have to deal with as we come out of the pandemic is a growing joblessness problem. The good news is there are lots of jobs to be done in repairing our planet. So that's in a way, one way of addressing our unemployment crisis is to put people to work on repairing our degraded ecosystems, re-wetting our boglands, cleaning up our industrial processes and so on to make them regenerative as opposed to degenerative. This is a rather chilling kind of confluence of the pandemic and the planetary emergency. This was taken from the Californian bushfires, which happened last year, in terms of there you see, the familiar mantra we have around the pandemic of wash your hands, wear a mask, and so on. But it's against the backdrop of the raging fires that happened in California last year. Now, they're not directly caused by climate breakdown, but bushfires happen in Australia and California as part of the natural ecosystem cycle. But along with typhoons and hurricanes, these natural cycles, which are always destructive of human habitation, but actually can be quite positive for the ecosystem, these are getting much more exacerbated as a result. So hurricanes are much more intense. Bushfires are burning longer and with much greater ferocity and so on. So I'm not making the case that every natural disaster we see around the planet is as a result of the planetary crisis, but these are exacerbated and getting more severe. Here's a man that certainly would not be my ideological cup of tea. He is a poster child for neoliberal capitalism and that the state is bad and the free market is good. But this man, Milton Friedman, I think actually, made a very good point in terms of a crisis as an opportunity for radical change. I mean, this is also in our own lives where, a crisis is an opportunity to grow and do something differently. And I think actually, when it comes to societies, the pandemic should be viewed in this particular way as well, that it's an opportunity to create a different type of economy and society. So I'm going to give you a version of a talk I've been given for the past year. Soon into lockdown last year, I wrote as a typical academic, I was reflecting on the experience of the pandemic and my longer standing interest in the planetary crisis going back a number of decades. And so I wrote a wee pamphlet that you might be interested in looking at in terms of the background to some of my thinking I'll present to you here today. And what we found is that the pandemic has cancelled the future, but that's okay because it's a pretty crap one anyway. Why on earth would anyone want to go back to normal, or what I now call the BC economy and world, the before COVID economy and world, And now to use this crisis as I said, the opportunity to build back better, to reset, to recalibrate, to move from a degenerative kind of what's Naomi Klein, that some of you may know, the great Canadian activist and scholar. She calls it, what we're currently in under neoliberalism is the dig and gig economy, this extractivist, unsustainable, and also very precarious economy that we see in whether it's Uber or Deliveroo and so on, this gig economy that has emerged in the last number of years. We need to move from that unsustainable and unjust economy to what she calls the care and repair economy. So if you fall asleep again in terms of what I'm saying here, it's moving from the dig and gig economy to the care and repair one. And many of you may have seen this particular cartoon doing the social media rounds last year. So we're fighting the pandemic, but actually the much bigger crisis that we need to address is the climate and indeed the ecological crisis. So therefore, the pandemic is an opportunity to rethink. I think we are all experiencing in different ways. It's uneven, it's divided by class, by gender, by ethnicity, but there is a sense of experiencing our universal vulnerability and indeed our interconnectedness. You know, people's health has certainly become much more prevalent, particularly gratifying in a way, the way in which we're talking more openly now about mental health and the challenges of mental health, particularly for our young people as we come back out of our, out of this particular pandemic. And I do think people can now begin to see and perhaps want, and we can have that discussion, of a different type of economy and society. You know, maybe we don't need to go into the office 5 days a week. Maybe we do want to work from home. Why do I need to travel thousands of miles to go to a conference, to give a 15-minute presentation and so on? I think for a lot of us, we're now rethinking, for those of us that have the opportunity, in terms of, our work lives, for example. And particularly, I go back to that issue that it's not that the economy has been closed, but we've really seen that to keep society functioning, as my brother, who's a busman in Dublin, laughed at me last year and he said, well, John, now we know who's a key worker. It's not a well-paid university professor who can work from home. It's actually a bus driver who's bringing people, into work and so on. And I do think there's something around recognizing who are essential workers, but ask ourselves two questions. For most of those in that essential worker category, it's overwhelming a feminized female workforce in health, retail, social care, but also why are they on low wages? So it's a question for us to ask. These are key workers that we now recognize, and we all clap for them. Remember that? Last year we clapped for them. I'm sure they would have much rather have better paying conditions, although the clap is probably welcome as well. And I do think what the pandemic has revealed is the truth of this multi-millionaire, capitalist. Again, I'm particularly channeling between Milton Friedman and Warren Buffett, people that I wouldn't usually agree with ideologically. But again, this idea that the pandemic has revealed that only when the tide goes out do we know who's naked. It's revealed a lot of structural problems in our society. Many of us were aware that they were there already, but I think it's revealed them to a much bigger audience. I only think that is good in terms of hoping people don't forget what they've seen and actually begin to see that we need to put in ameliorative changes in terms of, again, the idea of building back better. I don't think we're all in this together, despite the mantra. I certainly think there have been major issues around class, in terms of race, and certainly in terms of gender. And in particular, a rather sad story of how, a lot of NHS workers, again, often on low wages and conditions, put themselves on the line and they paid the ultimate sacrifice. I also think, as an aside, that we made a mistake in many societies by focusing too much on our frontline healthcare staff, and we neglected our care homes. And I do think there will be, inquiries into how different states handle the pandemic. And I certainly think that's one thing that will come out of it, that we actually neglected to keep our focus on what was happening in our care homes, and that a lot of our elderly population died perhaps unnecessarily because we were shifting resources and attention into, preventing the NHS, for example, being overwhelmed and so on, even though that was the best available epidemiological evidence at the time. Here's a phrase for those of you who know your Irish history, in terms of one way of understanding the Great Irish Famine, or on Gorta Moor, to give it its Irish phrase. This idea that the blight came from nature or the Almighty, but it was the English who caused the famine. And the point being made here, this is John Mitchell, one of the great Irish Fenians of the mid 19th century, is that famines are nearly always and everywhere political creations. Famines are the lack of access to food, not just the lack of food. Or to put it in terms of our contemporary pandemic, you could say that global capitalism created the virus in the sense of the encroachment into wilderness areas in Wuhan, and hands up who heard of Wuhan before all of this happened. But I'm trying to, see, is there a parallel between what Mitchell was saying? And again, of course, it's contested. I'm not saying everybody's going to agree with this, but there's something that the pandemic has been caused by the way in which natural or national capitalisms, how particular states have reacted. Why is it that places like Taiwan and Vietnam and New Zealand, they didn't seem to have the same problems that we had? They handled the pandemic in a much better manner. Why, for example, was our policy in Britain and Ireland living with COVID as opposed to zero COVID strategies? That's what I mean by it was nation states, I think, that actually caused the pandemic, but the virus itself is a result of the encroachment by human beings into wilderness areas where we're releasing pathogens and viruses that we've not come into touch with or into contact with before. And just as a way of explanation, not least because of the helpful intervention by groups like Black Lives Matter, John Mitchell, who I just mentioned, was a racist. Even though he's often seen in the Irish Republican movement as a great hero, he held pro-slavery views. And there's a story from earlier on last year of a debate happening in Newry where there's a statue in terms of, it's not just, what's happening in Bristol and elsewhere around our reckoning with our colonial slavery and racist past. So just as a way of giving more context to particularly that historical character, John Mitchell, I just mentioned. I think some of the lessons that we can see from the coronavirus and responses, well, states can move quickly and effectively. Again, unevenly, there are issues around, should states have done different things, but we can see that states can move quickly despite decades of neoliberal ideology telling us states were crap, that only markets were the most effective. In a crisis, it's not the free market that saves you, it's the state. And I do think there's, again, a lesson for us to be learned in how the state is really important. And sorry, Mrs. May, there is a magic money tree. Finance can be found to furlough workers, to invest in the rapid rollout of vaccination, to provide PPE, personal protective equipment, to frontline workers. For me, who's been going on for years about why is it that always states can find money for war, but not the NHS? Well, here's the proof, folks, that actually when there's a crisis, the state can find the money. And without boring you with this, we don't need to pay for this with austerity or increased taxes. If you're interested, look up modern monetary theory, which shows you that a sovereign currency issuing government like the UK does not need to raise taxes to pay for furloughing workers and all the investment. And that's maybe something for another imagined talk I can give you. What we've also seen is populations can adapt, working from home, social distancing, washing our hands, and so forth. And we have seen, high levels of solidarity. Yes, there have been some examples of, less than solidarity enhancing response. I mean, I think historians will look back at the early part of the pandemic and call it the great toilet roll famine in terms of the rush in many of the supermarkets for people rushing for toilet roll and so on. It certainly wouldn't be the top of my list, I have to say, if I was going for emergency shopping. But by and large, I think we've seen this sense of community, people looking out for each other. We're being a little bit kinder to each other as a result of the crisis that we're now experiencing. And I'll talk about this in a moment, how a complex issue, the epidemiological evidence around, particularly the flattening of the curve and so on, has been a way of communicating a very effective way to the public, what's often a complicated science-based argument and so on. So I do think that from all of these, and there's others we can talk about for reasons of time, I won't go into them all, I think there may be some warranted hope that in how we've addressed the pandemic, it's almost like we're exercising social and political and state financial muscles that haven't been exercised in a long time, perhaps with the exception maybe of war, that we're exercising these muscles as states and as communities during the pandemic that then we can use to help us now maybe rise to the challenge and the opportunity of the existing unsustainability of the planetary crisis that we're also experiencing. And this is this nice, I think, model that we can use from the pandemic, the one on the left, although it's less popular now, or we see it less now in the media, but certainly in the early parts of the pandemic, we had lots of variations of this curve on the left about, we have to flatten the curve. So to prevent NHS and other healthcare systems being overwhelmed. Well, I think we can use that same logic to addressing the climate crisis, of communicating to citizens why we're engaging in various forms of reductions of greenhouse gases as a way of bending the curve down. And the curve here is greenhouse gas emissions, so that people can see the effects of their actions, whether it's eating less red meat, driving their car less, cycling more, or whatever other reductions that we see for greenhouse gases, that citizens can begin to understand and see why we're engaging in these actions. But then why not do this for inequality? In terms of gender or racial inequality, so we can see as societies, well, how are we doing on addressing violence against women? Well, sadly, not very good, given what's happened in the last week or so, both in the UK and here in Northern Ireland, sadly. But I do think these are ways we can learn of communicating to the public these often complex issues about, explaining to people why we're asking them to engage in certain forms of behavioral change. Other lessons, I think, is that science can be applied unevenly and listened to and guide government actions. I think we've also seen once impossible policies being not only possible, but now necessary. Who would have thought that a right-wing conservative government would be introducing effectively socialist policies in terms of furloughing workers and investing massively in socialized medicine in the NHS? We have actually also seen short-term environmental and climate positive impacts. Some of you may have seen there were NASA satellite photographs of China prior to and after the introduction of lockdown. And of course, there was a pall of smoke over eastern China, where most of its heavy industry is, because it's mostly based on, oil and coal. Those factories all closed down because they went into lockdown and air quality improved. I mean, there's some evidence that is coming out from epidemiologists that actually more people may have had their lives saved in China as a result of the virus than would have died from it. And the simple reason being that the air quality improved to such an extent that those who've had their lives blighted or cut short by respiratory problems didn't have the same problems during those couple of months in which the air quality improved. And of course, we've seen not just, I don't think, short-term, I should really change that to short and long-term economic impacts. I mean, the sad reality is there are many people in our society who are unemployed. They just don't know it yet. And therefore, we're going to need a policy and a plan to address joblessness as we come out of this particular crisis. But I do think there's some of the lessons. Again, do these give us hope that we can actually address the climate crisis? But of course, it wasn't the case that science was listened to by all politicians or political leaders. Here's the bell, Donald Trump, remember him, who at one stage was encouraging populations to drink detergent as a way of addressing the virus. But there are differences. They're different. One of the first differences is that unlike the virus, we don't see the experience, or directly we in the northern world, the rich world, don't see the impacts of the planetary crisis that is already unfolding for many parts of the global south. It's happening elsewhere. Yes, occasionally we will have, focusing events like the dreadful flooding we had around Derry and Strabane a few years ago. We've had flooding in other parts of England and Ireland, but they're episodic and people are not experiencing the same way of, say, desertification in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which is having a much more devastating and longer lasting impact on people's lives. The second issue, which is different than the virus, between that and the climate crisis, there's nobody lobbying to keep the pandemic going, although maybe there may be some in AstraZeneca and pharmaceutical companies who see profit-making potentials. But by and large, we're not seeing a lobby group that want the virus to spread even more. Whereas on the planetary crisis, there are very powerful interests, particularly in the fossil fuel sector, who do want to continue keeping us hooked on their product, which is oil and gas. And that's an example here of the political and economic power of these organizations. This is a snapshot from 2 years ago. So it's how much these fossil fuel companies are spending on lobbying in 2019. And that's a difference between the pandemic, if you like, and the planetary crisis. But I do think, just to begin to wind up, that out of the crisis that we're going through at the moment, there is a growing call, I think, to build back better, to have a just and inclusive recovery as we come out of COVID-19. Some of you may have seen examples of this online. Some of you may even be involved in the Building Back Better campaign here in Northern Ireland and the UK. But there's one example of the type of principles, put people's health first, that actually the economy should serve society. To me, that's an uncontroversial take-home lesson for what we're all going through in terms of seeing that our health is more important than necessarily these economic considerations that we often hear on the news and so forth. And, this idea of building back better, it's not all from lefty greenies like me, just to give you full disclosure in case you didn't know my ideological composition, but also you find this argument for a great reset also coming from captains of industry. So here's one example by the man's name on the top left right-hand corner, Klaus Schwab. This is from Time magazine, and Klaus Schwab is the founder of the World Economic Forum. This is the leaders and the rulers of the planet that meet in Davos in Switzerland every year. They're all behind this idea. So what they want is green capitalism. So I think that the terrain of politics now is shifting. It's going to be between green capitalism and what I would call green eco-socialism, just to give you a heads up as to where my thinking is going in terms of the current way in which our politics are being reshaped. And I do think there are lots of good arguments for investing in whether it's a just transition or a Green New Deal or a green jobs-led recovery. Here are just two examples, not from particularly radical speakers or organizations. Fatih Birol is the head of the International Energy Agency. Antonio Guterres is the head of the United Nations Environment Programme, both eminent insiders, but they're all getting behind this idea of building back better and the Green New Deal. So whenever you hear building back better, don't automatically assume it's a left progressive agenda. It may simply be about greening the business as usual scenario that we have at the moment. And again, shameless self-promotion here. I wrote something about this again last April. I clearly was really bored out of my head last April, and I'm writing all these things about the pandemic and the planetary emergency. And I'm probably channeling my inner Van Morrison, where I'm confusing repetition for development. Sorry to any Van. Van is a great man, but I do think there is an issue about, well, is he simply repeating in a different way the same kind of riff for the couple of decades that he's been king? So just begin to wind up. What does this green and inclusive recovery perhaps look like? And I do think we can address a number of problems in terms of this green and inclusive recovery. We can definitely address unemployment. There's lots of jobs to be done. We can address extreme inequality, and therefore we can combine climate and social justice in this green recovery. We can certainly address, it's a shame for those of us who live in Northern Ireland that we live in a part of Europe, in a supposedly advanced industrial, liberal, democratic, capitalist society, where if you look at the Department for Communities website, it will tell you that 42% of households in Northern Ireland are living in fuel poverty. That means they're spending more than 10% of their income just to simply stay warm. And that should be a shame. And where do we see the massive campaign, the outcry within Northern Ireland around issues like that? If there was a flag attached to this, or there was a border poll, we'd probably have more political traction on it. And that's of course, a perennial issue in Northern Ireland. Poor air quality, I want to talk about this more in a moment, which seems innocuous and a minor issue. It's actually a major issue in terms of public health and people's lives. We could address food insecurity. One of the things the pandemic has thrown up, and certainly is part of the problem with the planetary crisis, is long carbon-intensive food supply chains around the world. It's also an issue that our heavily chemicalized, industrialized, carbon-intensive food system is simply unsustainable, which is a particular issue for our farming community as we move to a climate-resilient economy. We're going to have to engage in a serious conversation of how they can have a less carbon and less ecologically damaging form of food production as we go forward. And I think also, to bring out the inner socialist in me, we're going to have to start defending the welfare state, not least in the healthcare system, but also education. I also think there's issues around why on earth do we not have a natural monopoly in the rail system in the UK and Ireland? These are natural monopolies which lend themselves to be nationalised. So for me, there's a big issue around these essential needs we have for transportation, for food, for education, for healthcare. These are the key issues that we should really be focusing on as we come out of the crisis. And in particular, because there's a complicated connection between how, certainly in the UK, the financial sector has become so large, disproportionately large and powerful in terms of providing, a greater proportion of UK GDP than other countries. We're going to have to make just as I said, the economy should serve society, finance should serve the real economy. Just to go back to the categories of workers I mentioned earlier, from a societal point of view, which do we think brings most benefit? A healthcare worker or somebody pressing a screen speculating on currency? And there's a piece of research that was done some years ago by the New Economics Foundation that showed that most of finance is bullshit jobs. It's not actually adding a lot of social value. And in fact, it's parasitic and it's destroying not only our economies, but actually the life supporting systems of the planet, given that these fossil fuel companies are inextricably linked to the finance sector, but it's extremely complex. My own pension scheme, for example, is invested in fossil fuels. Many of our pension schemes that we would have are invested in these very profitable but planet-destroying forms of investment. So we're going to have a serious reform of finance, and particularly around pensions and the banking sector. And I think we also need to, address the climate and biodiversity emergency, which, in case you didn't know, for those of you in Northern Ireland, did you know the Northern Ireland Assembly declared a climate and ecological emergency last February? For those of you who live in Belfast, did you know that Belfast City Council declared a similar emergency in October 2019? For those of you who consider yourself to be British, the UK Parliament declared this in May 2019. And for those who consider yourselves Irish, the Irish Parliament followed a week later. So we have all these declarations of emergencies, but in my view, the pandemic is what a real emergency looks like. So when our MLAs are looking for your vote in around this time next year, ask them, what are they going to do? Are they going to see the same action we saw with the pandemic? Are we going to see the same action when it comes to the planetary crisis, perhaps as a consideration of whether or not you're going to give them a vote? And the reason why I mentioned air quality, this is a remarkable report that's just come out earlier in February, just last month, in terms of 8 million people died worldwide in 2018 from air pollution from fossil fuel. That is 1 in 5 people on the planet died from our addiction to a fossil fuel economy. And this is a report coming out of Harvard and University of Leicester. And just to give you a sense of where these deaths are distributed across the world, there's a map. Sadly, as you can see, a lot in India, in China, a lot in Russia, but look at Europe and parts of North America and South America. So it's not just a global South issue, although it's disproportionately, impacted there. But in our own societies, I mean, look at the orange and red across parts of Britain. So it's not as if this is just an issue for the global South. Air quality is an issue across many of our cities. And again, it's been one of the strange benefits of the pandemic is that air quality in Belfast, in Dublin, in London, in Paris, in Milan, and so on, all these major cities improved as a result of the pandemic. And sadly, many of us can already see that the air quality is starting to go down again in Belfast as a result of cars returning. But to me, that's a an absolutely striking piece of research. 1 in 5 people across the planet dying because of our carbon-based energy system. If you want any other evidence, forget about even climate breakdown. If you're a Sammy Wilson type, ask him to consider this. That will improve human health to move to a low carbon energy future, regardless of one's views on the planetary crisis and climate breakdown. We have lots of support for people who want to move to a climate resilient and jobs and green led recovery, which I think is very positive. Even the bell Boris Johnson, although I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him, he's even had to come out last December with a green industrial revolution, talking about this green recovery piece, which I think is positive because we can use that then to press home with those politicians. You said you wanted a green recovery. Where is it? When is it going to happen? And particularly important about saying that, where's the jobs? Where are the green jobs in this green recovery strategy? I mean, sadly, as in politics, and I speak as a recovering politician, as many of you know, rhetoric is cheap. And here's an example of this, that even the stimulus report, the stimulus, commitments by governments in terms of coming out of the pandemic don't even match what we went through when we bailed out the banks over 10 years ago. So while I think there's a compelling science and human, health as well as a social justice dimension for this green recovery, we've also got to be aware of whether or not this becomes a bit like the Irish football team, great on paper, crap on grass. Other teams are available. And will we see a just transition, where no workers and communities are left behind in this transition? And we do also need to see that, there's a sad reality, which is not particularly a significant discussion on the island of Ireland. It is in parts of the UK and other countries where we're going to have to retire the fuel as a fossil fuel economy that's in the coal, oil and gas extraction, refining sectors. So that's a tough decision, but we have to engage in that because it's simply incompatible to continue burning fossil fuels and to have a habitable planet in the decades ahead. So I do think there's an opportunity, and whatever bailout packages governments have, how do we use this to retire certain sectors of our economy, make sure workers are retrained, they are, given early retirement packages perhaps, and how do we transform, our energy system, including, if we're bailing out, for example, airlines, which is a big issue, what conditions should government ask of airlines in terms of making the low carbon transition, given the impact of air flying on climate breakdown? And in particular, nothing without us, or nothing about us without us as citizens. We need to be included in this conversation, that it's not some top-down, technocratic, state-led process. So there has to be social dialogue, whether it's citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries or participatory budgeting. I really think, and I speak as somebody who was inside the liberal democratic system at local government for 7 years, the system isn't broke. It was made that way. I'm absolutely convinced that our current liberal representative political system is incapable of dealing with the challenge that we have facing us in terms of addressing the climate crisis. Does that mean we smash it? My view, no. But it absolutely has to be supplemented by more citizen involvement. And I think citizens' assemblies are a really interesting way in which that can be involved. There are other mechanisms that could be included. For those of you perhaps living in Northern Ireland are interested, how can we really invigorate the community planning process, where it's not just about organizations talking to each other, but actually citizens co-creating and place shaping how they want their areas to be developed in the years ahead. And just to give you with one local example, and I co-chaired the Belfast Climate Commission as an example of this kind of green recovery. We did a report that came out last year. I won't go through it all, but essentially what we found is, and it relates to the issue of fuel poverty, the single biggest carbon component of Belfast is in domestic and commercial buildings, particularly in domestic buildings, where people, because of bad insulation and our dependence upon oil for space heating, are often heating the streets and adding then not only to blighting their own lives, getting themselves into fuel poverty and being cold, but also adding to climate breakdown. So this means, and here's the kind of visualization of it, is the figures on the bottom. Just look at the greenhouse gas reduction opportunities for domestic heating. And this means that, a blind man or woman on a galloping horse could see that what we need to do in Belfast, and I think this, we haven't done the analysis for Northern Ireland as a whole, but I'd be surprised if it was any different than what we found here for Belfast. We should be employing thousands of people to retrofit our homes, to also ensure that we have low carbon systems of heating that will deliver multiple benefits, provide jobs, increase the local multiplier effect, because people on low income often, they only spend their money in the local economy. Therefore, that enhances the local resilience. And also we take them out of fuel poverty. And as a Brucey bonus, guess what? We reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These are the types of multiple benefits that I think we're going to absolutely need to get communities behind the low carbon energy transition. It can't just be that we say to people, get solar panels on your house, buy an electric car, or even insulate your house to save the planet. There has to be a benefit to the communities that we're asking this of. Otherwise, they may resist. Those you may recall the Gilets jaunes protests we've seen in France, where the government tried to impose a carbon tax on diesel. That led to ordinary, often working class people protesting against this. And we certainly don't want to see the same thing happening in any energy transition in Ireland or Northern Ireland. We need to bring people with us and to show them the benefits of the transition to a low carbon economy. So if we do all that, it's a big if, but if there's a popular support for building back better, for no going back, why on earth do we want to go back to normal? For a green and just recovery, we might, just might, begin to see that it's now easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take any questions or bookings for christenings, bar mitzvahs, or weddings. Right, my God, 16 questions here, right? Okay, I'm going to go through these as I see them. Garrett O'Sullivan has asked, the economy has been changed to an e-economy for better or worse? Open question. If you actually were to do the analysis of even what we're engaged in now in terms of using, online forms of communication, they are not carbon free or ecologically free of pollution and damage. To give you one frightening example in terms of data centers, particularly as part of the process in which the Republic of Ireland has attracted the likes of Google and Apple and so on with data centers, they take up an awful lot amount of water and electricity. So it's a mistake to think that an online paperless office or economy is going to be ecologically non-damaging. It's less, I think, but we have to look at it in the round in terms of seeing that there are certain advantages of moving to an e-economy. But how would you think if I was to tell you that if all the data centers that are planned for the Republic of Ireland were to go ahead, some projections would say that it's going to take up maybe between a quarter and a third of all electricity in the Republic. Some would argue that there are plans to take water from the Shannon to bring it to Dublin, not for domestic households, but to feed these new data centers. That's going to come at a heavy carbon and ecological cost. So while I'm not against technology or moving to the online experience and working from home, let's not fool ourselves that it somehow is going to be a silver bullet. It's in a similar category for me as electric cars, and I have an electric car myself. If you were to do the full life cycle analysis, if you were to look at the rare earth metals, cadmium, zinc, and so on that are involved in the battery production, we'd quickly see that there are many other ecological problems, even with these electrification of transportation. So I think actually when it comes to things like transportation, it's about not traveling if you can, bicycles or walking and so forth, not just about what I think is often a mistaken media presentation. And we even had it yesterday in the news about, the good news that Northern Ireland now has, at least on the floor of the Assembly, its first climate change bill, and how a lot of the media coverage was about the excitement about moving from internal combustion engine cars to electric cars. That's not certainly my view. I'm not against the electrification of transportation. And I think certainly when it comes to public transport, hydrogen has a lot more potential, particularly if it's generated from renewable energy sources. But I think we need to question these easy technological solutions because actually a lot of the changes we're going to need have to do with the structure of the economy and indeed behavioral changes and so on. Thank you, Martina. Read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, and Kate Rayward's Donut Economics, very good. Air quality was atrocious. Thank you, Connor. There are too many jobs that need to be done to keep our society healthy. Yes, there's absolutely, I think that idea of the care and repair economy, we have no end of work that needs doing. You know, why is it, have you ever wondered, you never see an army general outside a supermarket shaking a tin can, looking for a few bob for a new ballistic missile. I mean, just heard recently, the UK government embarking on yet another obscenity of spending millions of money on cruise missiles. It's almost like having, as somebody said last night on Twitter or Facebook or one of those, it's almost like having a house protected by sophisticated machinery and guard dogs, and the kids are starving inside. You know, why are we spending our money, our ingenuity, our technology on ever increasingly sophisticated ways to kill each other and not using that in terms of sustaining life? And I think that's an issue that has to be addressed in terms of particularly the military industrial and carceral complex and so on. Yvonne Blythe, recent news of jet fuel being developed from food waste, does that mean that the only future objections to huge numbers of people flying would be risk of spreading also? I don't know about that, Yvonne, whether or not that technology is mature enough that somehow we could continue our current levels of flying by using fuel derived from food waste. Food waste has been shown in anaerobic digestion. You can create fuel, but I'm not too sure it can sustain a heavy degree of air travel. And I think it's actually it's a good point maybe for me to give you a sense of how I see the energy transition. Most of us mistakenly, and the media is to blame, but also I think how research is presented, we think that the energy transition or the transportation transition is we have a certain quantum of carbon energy, and we're going to basically replace that with renewable energy. And my view is that's mistaken. What about energy reduction, energy conservation, energy efficiency? It seems to me that the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. And yet we don't see enough effort and discussion around that idea of energy reduction in a lot of debates around the energy transition. A word about tourism. This is from Catherine. Any suggestions how we convince people who consider themselves good recyclers they don't need to contribute to the climate crisis by jumping on flights over to London for the weekend or Costa del Sol for a week? In other words, how do we get through to the Egypts? It's an interesting social science phenomenon that we have some evidence that people who recycle a lot often see that they've done their bit for the climate and therefore they can, without guilt, then go off and fly. It's called the Rebound Effect in terms of their good actions can rebound and not deliver, a full reduction in their carbon footprint. It's similar to what we see on a societal level. For those of you like me who are grey and old will know that cars today, even internal combustion engine cars, are immeasurably more fuel efficient. They're lighter, they're produced using less energy and resources, and that has saved quite a lot of carbon and resources. But here's the problem. All those savings in production are outweighed by the fact that we're now driving more and there's more cars. We're going to have to address the issue of consumption, folks. And most of the attention in our politics is around production, green growth, a circular economy and efficiency. And nobody's really addressing the elephant in the room that we're going to have to redistribute consumption. And my own preferred option is to have much more socialized consumption, public transportation, libraries, laundromats, as opposed to privatized. And that's a big discussion to have. But actually, public transportation is mile for mile much more efficient than having us all in our own, even in our own electric cars and so on. So you heard it here first, folks, that what we need, and I'll give you the full rendition of my green lefty perspective, that the future for me is about socializing consumption and democratizing production. Why is it that democracy should end at the factory gate? Why is it democracy should end at the office door? I do think that, you know, we need to start thinking of new ways of organizing work and enabling more voice for workers in their positions of production and the world of work. I'm just going to jump around here. Yes, Declan from Friends of the Earth. Welcome, Declan. Air quality is poor in Europe as a result for a push to diesel, which is absolutely true, and the law of unintended consequences. I think, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to, because I can't read them quick enough, and there may be other people. You want to put up your, I think we can, I don't know whether we can we use the raised hand function and you can unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment? I don't know, Tommy, if you're on there, is that possible? Does somebody want to try unmute yourself and see if you can ask a question? Maybe it's not possible. I think then let's have a look at some of your other questions. Michael, hello, Michael, from the Kingdom of Cooltrad, the People's Republic of Hollywood Upper, say hello to you. You're a keen advocate for local democratic engagement. Has democracy the maturity and wisdom to rise to the challenge of the realities facing it? While I have skepticism about the current institutions and indeed political parties that in a way comprise our democracy, I have great faith in people. I mean, the human species are an incredibly resilient race. I mean, even the most apocalyptic vision of the future, I don't see that as somehow meaning there's the end of the earth or human beings. It's the immeasurable, unavoidable suffering that we can, you know, see if we don't actually begin to engage in the types of changes that many of us would say that we have to do. So for me, it's about not necessarily the maturity of our democracy. As I said, I think the system needs to be supplemented. It's actually the anger and vision of our citizens. Do people care about these issues? Are they going to mobilize for them in terms of non-violent, action and so on? I do think the pandemic as a negative, and it has, of course, had many negative impacts. I think the rising youth strike for climate movement, the growing militancy of the climate justice movement, and with things like Extinction Rebellion, I think all that's been stopped as a result of the pandemic. My hope is that that momentum that was building up, and that was, to me, the reason behind these governments and assemblies and councils declaring climate and ecological emergencies, was as a result of those young people striking, the inspiration from young people like Greta Thunberg. And also, to be fair, at the other end of the age spectrum, I think Sir David Attenborough can hold his head up high in terms of doing an awful lot in terms of bringing to a popular audience the climate crisis. He was a bit too milk and waterish for me when it comes to solutions in terms of some of his more recent programs, and that's for a different discussion. But I hope that as we come out of the pandemic, and we begin to be able to engage in not just online activism, but actually those street level protests, that we begin to, that reassertion of, I think, that youthful anger, because these young people don't have a vote, but they have a voice. And many of them feel very betrayed by the older generation, and that we had the science. Did we do enough? Do we think that just voting for the Green Party, for example, is going to be enough? That's it, I've done my bit. My own view, it's not. We're going to need a mobilization of the sorts that we've seen historically around the abolition of slavery. I think if that's the scale of what we're looking at, the struggle for women's right to vote, that wasn't done by politely asking a male MP, oh, please give us the right to vote. That required political struggle. And that's what I think is going to be involved in this particular issue. And there's none greater in terms of the existential challenge that we've been describing here. I have another, that's a direct message to me, as opposed to I'll answer that myself. Roy asked, it will cost about...
John, just to let you know, I can unmute people if you want to let me know whose question you'd like to take, and people can raise their hands in the reactions tab at the bottom of Zoom.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tommy. I see David and Felicity's hand up.
Well, Felicity, if I'm the Felicity, was just trying to say that the host needed to unmute people, but he's just said that now, and I'm not sure if I can cancel my hand.
Okay, no problem. Thanks, Felicity. Garrett, I have.
All right, can you hear me, John?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, no, just a question in general, just around somebody who was in the Green Party that you used to be chairman of. How do you see the politics in Northern Ireland dealing with all this going forward, given that it doesn't seem to be that high up the agenda, this whole notion of what we need to do to actually do, to prevent a climate emergency?
Well, I'm going to give you 3 letters, DUP. The DUP are the only party that didn't support, well, no, 3 other letters, the TUV, but then they're only an offshoot of the DUP. Only 2 parties in the Assembly have not got behind this climate change bill, which was introduced yesterday. I think the climate change bill is not going to solve all these issues, but at least it gets it on the political agenda. It gives a legislative footing for reductions in carbon. So I do think, why is it the DUP is against this? Why on earth should this even be it's not even a sectarian issue. I mean, the earth doesn't care if you're Catholic, Protestant, or the centre. The sea levels are going to rise and so on. It is sad and it has to be recognised. There are, people who don't accept evolution in the DUP. So how on earth are they going to accept climate science and so on? And also, I do think, though, there is a political dynamic between the Ulster Farmers Union and the DUP, which is not very positive. And I do think that, if you listen back to some of the discussions around the media discussions about the climate change bill, straight away on the BBC, there were farmers slagging it off and so on. And my view is farmers are stewards of the land. They should see this as an opportunity. They know, you talk to farmers, they know that the weather is not right. And they don't want to be destroying the earth, but they need incentives and help. And so I'd certainly think that we need what I would call a just transition for our farming communities. And what's unique in Ireland, the island of Ireland is unique in Europe, is that our biggest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions don't come from transportation or fossil fuel extraction. They come from farming. So there's a major issue just practically that we have to have a different farming system. We have to invest in nature-based solutions, which again would provide jobs for people as we come out of the pandemic. So I do think there's a particular issue here in Northern Ireland, and I would lay it firmly at the foot of the DUP, particularly when it comes to not supporting climate action. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Well, if people, I'm not saying any other. Oh, Zand, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Good to see you. Maybe just to. Well, 2 things to follow up then on that, on the farming side of things. I'm just curious from your experience in Northern Ireland, is there anyone who's is leading the way in regenerative farming or exploring that capability, if that is a core area of our overall transition of modeling more sustainable farming practices that you know of? Because I think that those kind of edge riders are really important kind of little beacons of light of people who are beginning that transition. And then maybe just because it just did go to Stormont yesterday, and obviously it hasn't been debated yet, but any reflections on just where you think how the climate bill will progress, or how that will kind of progress through Stormont, and whether, I haven't fully read it yet, so I don't know if there's any provisions in there around agriculture or other areas. We've had some questions around retrofit and other things that are moving through.
Well, thanks, Sam. Well, on the first question, it's more from my own personal experience. I do think what we need to move towards is away from an industrialized, chemicalized farming system to agroecology. And that would also then include organic. And I suppose the organic farming sector is something I know a little bit more about, mostly because a local farmer here in Helens Bay, John McCormick, that Mike Harper would know very well. I think he's been a pioneer in terms of that regenerative, nature-based, environmentally friendly forms of agriculture for many, many years. But I do think that beyond organic is agroecology, and there's quite a lot of research being done on that, but I'm not aware of any agroecological, even farm trials here in Northern Ireland. I'd also, make a mention of for Johnny Hanson, who's another farmer out near Antrim, who's also engaged in community-based farming as well. So there are examples of pioneers. But I also think ordinary farmers are also trying to do their bit in terms of, replanting native woodland, protecting hedgerows. So I wouldn't like to present that somehow there's an us and them, that all farmers involved in the mainstream industrial sector are all bad. They are just responding to the incentives that they have. But I do think that we're going to have a lot more research and thinking about non-carbon, non-chemicalized, or less carbon and less chemicalized forms of food production. And again, I've not been involved heavily in the climate change bill, but I think a bit like, and interesting enough that in the Irish cabinet today, there's an enhanced climate change act going through as well. So there's kind of strange synergy between North and South on climate change legislation. And I haven't seen any particular provisions around farming. My fear is with the climate change bill as it's going through the Assembly, in case people don't know, Minister Poots, who's the Minister for DERA, that's the Department of Environment, Agriculture and Rural Affairs, he has not backed the current bill that's going through the Assembly. He wants his department to have their own bill, which for me, I just throw my head up to the heavens and say, why, for goodness sake, doesn't he and the DUP and the department get behind this current bill, make their arguments and amendments? Because I fear, I've no evidence of this, but I can see, as somebody who was involved in the dark arts of politics for many, many years, that is the DUP's game plan here, is to prevent this current bill that was introduced yesterday from going through the Assembly in this current mandate, which will run out around this time next year. In other words, kick it into the long grass and say, oh, we'll pick it up in the next Assembly. And that's why we as citizens, those of us who have votes and are interested in politics in Northern Ireland, that's what we should be demanding of our political representatives. Sadly, I can see how that makes sense. You just simply kick this into the long grass. It doesn't get through this Assembly. There's delay, there's bluster. And next of all, we have a new election happening in 2022. So that's not a very positive reading, Zand. I think it's wonderful that we've had this cross-party support for this bill, which is, almost a first in Northern Ireland. And also, that's not been remarked upon, is how quickly this bill went from last May to now being, which is remarkably quick, despite Minister Poots thinking it was ridiculous that we could have a bill introduced so quickly. Well, there you go, Edwin. When there's a will, there's a way. And all we need for him to do is get out of the way to enable this bill to be implemented. Perhaps I should leave it there because we're up at the hour, unless anyone's got any other burning question or comment, or indeed, as I say, to book me for bar mitzvahs or weddings or christenings. Well, thank you all for listening, folks. I hope you found that, well, you can call it infotainment maybe. Well, I'd like to call it infotainment, that you've been entertained, provoked, and given a bit of information. I wish you all the best. Take care of yourselves. Wash your hands and socially distance from neoliberalism. It's not good for your health. So listen, go well and take care.